Good morning, Highland. Glad you can join me today in this Bible study as we continue to look at the book of Genesis. And of course, if you've been watching with us, or maybe you're new to the class, we've been using the Foundations Quarterly from the Gospel Advocate as our base or our reading for the week. So hopefully you read that and got a little bit of insight from the booklet. We are in Genesis chapter 23. Genesis chapter 23. And what I want to do is I want to read really verses 1 through 9 first, and then read the second half later. So we're going to try to break this down in a certain way because we have two main points that we want to cover from this chapter. So, again, Genesis chapter 23 in verses 1 through 20, but we're going to read right now verses 1 through 9. I think I said 6. I apologize. Verses 1 through 9 here. So there's some hard names in here, so just bear with me. You may have heard these names pronounced differently, but here we go. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kirath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. So that's Genesis 23 verses 1 through 9, and we'll read the second half a little later. But the title of this lesson, and probably even the title of your heading, maybe even in your Bible, is The Burial of a Faithful Wife. The Burial of a Faithful Wife. Obviously, tragedy strikes Abraham and his family here in this passage. And Abraham is not, would not be foreign to the concept of grieving. Last week we talked about Abraham and Isaac and the fact that God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So there would have been, as we discussed in that chapter last week, there would have been a grieving process that Abraham most likely went through, even though he never actually fulfilled what God told him to do. God stopped him before he did it, but he would have gone through some type of grieving process. The process of grieving would have begun for Abraham to have to sacrifice his only son, or the promised son, rather. So he's not foreign to the idea of grief. But of course, we know that the death of this individual actually does happen. The death of Sarah. But there's more to this than just the death of Sarah and her burial. Her burial signifies more than just a man grieving the loss of his wife. So I want to cover really two aspects. Really I guess technically we can cover three. And the first point is the faithfulness of Sarah. The second is the grieving process of Abraham. And there's some insight in there on how we even deal with our grieving process when a loved one passes from this life. And then the significance of where Sarah is buried. And I place that at the end because I think that is the far more important point to this chapter than probably the other two. So let's discuss this. So really, again, we have 3 points here. And let's talk about, first of all, the faithfulness of Sarah. In Hebrews chapter 11, Sarah is mentioned as one of the champions of faith. Now, I believe that Sarah was a faithful wife to Abraham. And that is completely true. We don't read anywhere that Sarah, married another husband. That was not common during that time anyway, this patriarchal age. And we do not see Sarah cheating, infidelity against Abraham. We don't see that. Now, we may see Abraham on the suggestion of Sarah to marry someone else other than Sarah, right? Hence, we get Ishmael. But we know we're pretty certain that Sarah was a faithful wife to Abraham throughout her entire marriage. But that's not necessarily what Hebrews is highlighting. What Hebrews is highlighting is that Sarah was a faithful child of God, despite the fact that she had moments of faithlessness. We know this because we know that she had a moment of faithfulness because she was the one that suggested to Abraham to marry Hagar to basically speed up the process of bringing in the promised son that God had promised. But what's interesting about Sarah is that she is mentioned as the modeled wife in Hebrews chapter 11. So there is an aspect here that her faithfulness to Abraham is definitely somewhat highlighted here. But the fact that she is a model Christian woman is the emphasis here in Hebrews chapter 11. And oftentimes, her being a faithful Christian woman is balanced out or is contrast with Jezebel, and the fact that Jezebel was not a faithful Christian woman or a faithful child of God by any means. So often the question that the apostles will bring up to the women is, would you rather be a daughter of Sarah or a daughter of Jezebel? Right? Would you rather be a child of God or be a heathen? That's basically what the apostles are asking women of faith, or maybe even possibly women who are considering to become women of God, faithful women of God. So it's so interesting to me that even though we see some of Sarah's faults, we see even Abraham's faults, they are still champions of faith, and that's what they're remembered for. Not their failures, but their successes in God. And both of these individuals look forward to the Messiah to one day redeem them from their troubles. So it's interesting to me that we see Sarah still a champion of faith, even at the end of her life. And she is spoken of in a good way throughout Scripture, other than one of those moments where she flopped. But we all do. So I just wanted to point that out for a moment, that sin doesn't have to define you, but that your relationship with God is what would really define you, your character in God, your identity in God. And if you're going to watch the sermon this afternoon, we're going to be talking about surrendering our identity. So Sarah was definitely a faithful woman, a faithful child of God, even to the end, despite some of the mistakes that she made. But let's get into location. Where are we in this story? Where are we in this account? Well, Abraham, at this point, Abraham and his family would have relocated here at Kirith Arba, which is known as Hebron. So if you would, I'll use my arrow here. So we're talking about this area here. So there's the city of Hebron, which they would have been at. So near Hebron, close to Mamre. Okay, so about this area. But what's significant about this is that they are now in the land of Canaan, and we'll come back to that because that's going to be very important to the end of our discussion. So just so you know geographically, this is the area that Abraham and his family are in. So this is the area that Sarah would have died and is going to be buried. So let's look into this. Another point about Sarah is definitely her age. She was 127 years old, according to verse number 1. Now, that's significant because we really don't have people living to this age, obviously, but we do have people who live not far from this age. So I neglected. I was going to look up what the oldest age of a person living today, who's the oldest person living in the world today. But I know that there have been people who have lived even past 110. Now, to you and I, it almost seems impossible. But we still have people who are living still 10 years past 100, maybe even older. So it's not a stretch that Sarah would have lived at 127 years old, especially during this time. We're only hundreds of years away from the flood. Before the flood, you had people living, Methuselah was over the age of 900? So you had people who lived very long lives before the flood, and that was due to the climate. There was a vapor that surrounded the earth, and so the sun rays wouldn't directly hit you. So you had individuals who could live very long lives. Both Adam and Eve lived long lives, and many people during that time. Even Noah would have lived a long life. But as the vapor was broken and the flood happened, on the earth, and now the sun rays are more directly hitting individuals, and climate change is happening all the time, you have people living less and less, and you have more diseases after the flood, and cancers, and all these things that are now a part of our everyday life as we know it. So the lifespan shortens, right? But now that we're having more modern medicine being introduced, our lifespans are gaining more. They're extending more. So now you have more people living into their 90s, into their hundreds, and that was almost rare to find somebody living that long, back in the 1800s or early on. The lifespan was very short for many people because of all the diseases and stuff, and the advancement of medicine wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So it's not a stretch to see that Sarah lived this long, especially since we're hundreds of years from the flood versus now thousands of years from the flood. So Sarah is 127 years old, so she lived a very long life. But her life, of course, is cut short. I said cut short. It wasn't short, but it was finally has ended, and she dies in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So Abraham and Sarah were married for a very long time. So could you imagine? Think about people who are married 50 plus years. Maybe you're watching this and you are one of those people. You've been married longer than you were a child, right? Or not married, right? Single. So your identity is very much wrapped into being married to your spouse. So this first point of basically going through Abraham's grieving process, Abraham is human. So Abraham is definitely mourning and weeping, missing his long relationship with his wonderful wife Sarah. And they've been through a lot in the time that they've been together for over 100, basically over 100 years, if I were to estimate. So a very long relationship that they would have had. I'm sure Abraham would have been grieving very much so. Now, if you know Eastern culture, the way in which that people would have grieved during this time, they would have basically been very public with their grieving. So it would be like someone, and maybe in the 1800s, I don't think this is as popular now as it was then, but part of the grieving process was, a woman would wear a black gown, signifying that her husband had passed, or maybe someone in her family. You would wear black, and not just at the funeral, but you would wear it for some time, basically signifying to others that you're grieving over the loss of a loved one, especially if you're grieving the loss over a spouse. So that was very common during the 1800s and even the early 1900s. So just kind of think about it that way. In this culture, you would go to the city gate and you would actually mourn. So it was very a public thing. In this kind of culture would even go into even Israel's history. That part of the mourning was, public. Jesus would actually have to come in on the scene and actually call out some of those Jews who were mourning and fasting in public in order to be seen of people, right? But this was a common practice in Eastern tradition. Your mourning, your weeping would definitely be publicized. It would be public. And I don't think it would be public for the idea of being seen, but rather it would be public for people to then join in with you and care for you and be there for you. So Abraham would have wept for Sarah in public in the city gates. And so this would not be any, people would have known about Abraham and the loss of his wife. And I'm pretty sure that Isaac was probably with him, and probably Ishmael may even have been in the area. We do know that Ishmael will be there with Isaac when Abraham passes away. We're not entirely sure if he's here in this passage, but I would imagine that maybe it's likely that maybe he would have been there for his father during a very hard time, even though Sarah was not his his mother. But that's possible. That's just my 2 cents. I could be wrong. But anyways, just like how families are there for each other, even now. So Abraham went and mourned for Sarah and was weeping. So this was a huge loss for Abraham and his family. So when we get to verse number 4, he's in a new area. They have not made themselves owners of the land that they are in. Now that's going to be significant again when we discuss our third point, our last point. But I want you to think about this. When Abraham approaches the Hittites who are living in the area, he approaches this. He approaches this court system, and these lords. And in this system, he is basically pleading in this hearing for his case of basically buying property in order to bury Sarah. And so he says, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. So he's going to, again, to this group of individuals who are probably some type of officials, and this would have been common practice during this time, especially to someone who is not a member of that society. He's a foreigner. He's a sojourner. So he's asking for permission to buy property in this land in order to bury his wife. And keep in mind, in the climate that they're in, burying an individual would have been priority, because obviously in a very humid environment, you can't really preserve a body very well. So in a lot of cases, you would actually bury your loved one the same day they die. So it's quite possible that we're talking about within the same day, within pretty close time frame from the time that Sarah dies, she's going to be buried. So this is a very expedient process that Abraham's going to have to go through. So again, imagine the grief that he's experiencing, having to pretty much, in a nutshell, bury his wife within a very short time of her death, within a very short time after her death. So Abraham's grieving. He is doing exactly what loved ones usually do during this time. And I would say that this is something that we all, part of the grieving process is definitely making arrangements to bury someone that we love. Whether you are doing it with other family members or someone who's close with you, this is a process. This is part of the grieving process. This is something that we all have to face at some point. So Abraham is facing this, and so he communicates with this group, and he asks for this place to bury his wife. But notice in verse number 6, notice the relationship already between Abraham and the Hittites here. These officials, these lords. First of all, they call him Lord. Hear us, my Lord. And that was a respectful title that you would give to someone that you respected. So they respected Abraham. But not only that, they said, you are a prince of God among us. Or you are someone that God has anointed. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. Wherever you want to bury your loved one, go ahead. You can take whichever lot from us, and we will not hinder you. So Abraham had a great reputation even among people that he's new to the community. Even as a foreigner, he had a great reputation. So much so that they were willing to give him pretty much any property that they own. So people are looking out for Abraham during his time of grieving. And so it's very evident here with Abraham in the grieving process. So we discussed that Sarah was definitely a faithful woman, even to the end, that her faults did not define her, that her faithfulness in God defined her. We see that Abraham is going through a grieving process that all of us at some point will go through unless we go first. But we all experience death, and we all experience having to bury a loved one or someone who is close to us. So this is a similar grieving process. So again, Abraham is 100% human and going through the things that you and I go through. He's not some type of superhero that we can't relate with, is really the point that I want to make in this second point. But the last point is what we want to spend most of our time and the remainder of our time in. because I think it's the most significant point from this passage. And that is, again, the significance of where Sarah is being buried. So you go back to verse number 2, and remember, they are in the land of Canaan where Sarah dies. They're in the land of Canaan. They're in the city of Hebron. Okay? That's significant. Why? If you go all the way back to the promise that God gave at the beginning, where did he say, or what land was Abraham and his descendants promised? Canaan. They were promised Canaan. So this is Abraham actually making it into the promised land. But here's the situation. Abraham does not own any property in this city, in this land. So, obviously, when you have ownership of something, if something has been given to you, then you own that property. So it's interesting that God has promised him something that he doesn't actually have a deed to. He has no legal grounds to basically say that this is his land. The only grounds that he can say that this is his land is because the Most High told him it's his land. Right? So, but he has no property. He doesn't own anything, even though God has told him that this is going to be his land and his descendants' land. So it's interesting, right? So here is Abraham, and he's about to basically take claim to the promise. He's going to actually own a piece of property, or he is trying to own an actual piece of property in the very land that God is promising him. That's significant because of the fact that this is the land, the very land that God is going to promise to him and his descendants. So he's trying to purchase this land. But in this trying and purchasing this land, they are, he already knows of the land he wants to purchase. So if you look at verses 8 through 9, there is a specific land that is owned by Ephron, which is the son of Zohar. This would have been someone that the community would have definitely known, someone probably of great wealth. And he already knows there's this cave called, this cave of Mechphilia, which Ephron owns, and it is at the end of his field. So it's a great grand stretch of property, and that's at the end of his property. And obviously, Abraham has had his eye on this property, or at least knows of this property for him to purchase for the burial plot for not only Sarah, but his entire descendants. Abraham would be buried here. Isaac, Rebekah would be buried here. So it's important to the family. And by the way, in this time, it's not as common today as it was then, but during these times, families were buried together in large plots. So that's exactly what Abraham is doing. He's buying this large plot for his family. So he already knows the field that he wants to purchase. But notice this. He's willing to pay full price for this property. He probably knows that this property is expensive, but he's willing to pay whatever price it is, whatever price that may be. So I want you to look at starting at verse number 10. Verse number 10. So, we're going to read verses 10 through the end of the chapter. Verse 10 through the end of the chapter. So, second half of Genesis 23. Now Ephraim was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephraim the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites of all who went in at the gate of his city. No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people I give it to you. Bury your dead. And Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, "But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field, accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there." Ephron answered Abraham, "My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. So Abraham starts to make starts to talk to Ephron, and in this discussion, he again is willing to pay 400 shekels. This is Ephron's asking price. And by the way, when these scriptures talk about giving the land over to Abraham, it's not saying that they're just going to give it to Abraham for free. The language in the Eastern culture, which is basically the same even today, they're going to basically negotiate. Haggling goes on here. If the closest you can probably think to this is maybe if you were to go to a swap meet today, there are you can negotiate in price with merchants. So that's the language here, and that's exactly what Ephron is betting that Abraham's going to do, because 400 shekels of silver was an expensive price for a plot of land. So I'm sure Ephron's thinking, oh yeah, you're going to haggle with this price. You're going to negotiate with me. But he doesn't negotiate. He doesn't negotiate. Verse 16, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites. So now Abraham is a landowner. He owns a piece of property in the very promised land that God was going to give to him. So the promise is being fulfilled. It's coming to fruition. Especially now that Abraham owns a piece of property in the promised land. So you can see this land was probably a very beautiful land, a very spacious land, and had probably a beautiful cave, a burial place for him and his family. So Abraham now possesses this land. So the major point here is that this burial signifies that the promise is continuing on. The promise that God is giving Abraham and his descendants are being made into fruition. And that's significant, because through this promise we get Jesus the Messiah. So there may not be a whole lot of deep theological study through this chapter. There may not be a lot of stuff in this chapter, but really the significance of this chapter, I believe, is that the promises of God are still coming to fruition. And my question to you is, can you see the promises of God happening throughout your life? Can you see the promise of salvation happening through your life now? I mean, Abraham was living the promise. Even though he wasn't going to see all of his descendants, even though he wasn't going to see the seed promise being the Messiah, Jesus Christ, physically, he is still witnessing parts of the promise unfolding. Do we truly have faith and see the promises of God happening in our life? That is really the takeaway question that I want you to think about from this chapter. Hopefully, the answer is yes. We see the promises happening even in our lifetime. And that keeps us moving forward. Because the promises are happening. We may not be in the physical place of heaven yet, but it's being prepared. And we are living in the heavenly kingdom right now as members of the body of Christ because of this seed promise given to and land promise given to Abraham many, many years ago. So the promise is still being unfolded. The Abrahamic promise is still being unfolded. And it was even happening during the life of Abraham. So that's really your lesson for this morning. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful to you. And hopefully we can live out and trust in the promises of God and have the same faith as Abraham and Sarah in this. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for joining us, and we hope and pray that our messages are encouraging and are uplifting and are helpful in your walk with God. To get more information and more content for your journey with God, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also join us on Facebook and like our page there, and you'll get all of our messages, our Bible classes, and any other messages that might come down our pipe as we continue to create and try to share God's Word. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.